Ladies and gentlemen, we are winning. After the last 2 days of allowing the Democrats to be themselves, to share their inner thoughts with the American people, the 2020 election is looking more and more cheerful. They were kind of a match, every single one of them. I mean, it wasn't like, where's the moderate in this, crowd? Every one of them who was originally advertising themselves perhaps that way went the full Monty and to the left. They're running as a combination, every single one of them. I mean, it doesn't really matter which one they pick now because there's only one, it's all vanilla. And they're running as a combination of George McGovern and Walter Mondale. George McGovern in 1972 picked up every left-wing idea you could think of at the time, okay? And said, I'm all of these things, he took the whole list, and he took a race that at one point Nixon was polling behind against other candidates who would not have run that obviously or honestly to the left, to where Richard Nixon swept the nation. And then, 12 years later, Walter Mondale ran. And he thought it was a good idea to open his campaign by looking at the American people on national TV and saying, I'm going to raise your taxes. And he carried one state. And the Democrats are bragging that they want to undo the Republican tax cut that passed in 2017. Now, the problem for the Democrats, it's a vague idea, both Clinton and our dear friend Obama said, I'm not going to raise your taxes, maybe the 1 or 2% over here, but not you. You might want to step out of the room. This may not be pleasant, but it's just those guys I'm working over, so it's really not you. And they ran promising not to raise taxes on 99% of the American people. They lied, of course, but because they raised taxes on everybody once they were in power. But they ran only going to get a couple guys, not you. So what happened was this time the Democrats are all saying to about 90% of the American people, I'm going to repeal the Republican tax cut, and if you go to your tax returns in 2019 and compare them to the ones in 2018, you can calculate how much money I will cost you next year and every year for the rest of your life. An mean average income family in the United States with 2 kids will pay more than $2,000 every year in higher taxes if a Democrat president repeals the Republican tax cut. 2,000 years, not one 2,000, 2,000, 2,000, 2,000, 2,000, every year out into the future. A single mother making $41,000 would pay over $1,300 more every year moving forward. So we're talking about a quantifiable cost. Remember that there's not a dime's worth of difference between the parties? Every American family will be able to calculate exactly how many tens of thousands of dimes a Democrat vote will cost them. Well, how did we get to this situation where the clarity between the two parties is so complete? I mean, we used to have two parties that basically there was a northern party and a southern party, and all it told you if somebody was Republican, he was born north of the Mason-Dixon line. And there were little old ladies in Mississippi who agreed with Ronald Reagan on absolutely everything and voted for George McGovern because Sherman had been unpleasant to Atlanta recently. And during the lifetime of President Reagan, the political lifetime of President Reagan, we sorted things out. There's one party that wants to leave you alone and lets you run your life. And there's one party that wants to tell you what kind of straws you're allowed to use. And they've invented a series of rules about how you're going to lead to this nanny state stuff. These are the guys who invented and mandated the toilets that are too small to flush completely, and the light bulbs that convince you have glaucoma. And then on the Sabbath, you have to separate the green glass from the white glass for the brown glass for all the recycling priests. And They have a list of things you have to do and a list of things you cannot do that is slightly longer and more tedious than Leviticus. It just goes on and on and on. Try and keep track of all the things that you're not allowed to do that were fine last week, but not now. So our team, the center-right, Reagan Republican, conservative, normal people, structure, people who want to mind their own business, raise their families, is actually a collection of groups, individuals, structures, of people who, on their vote-moving issue, what they want from the government is to be left alone. If you go around the table, who's there? Homeschoolers. Let me educate my own children. Homeschoolers do not knock on your door and tell you to homeschool. They don't insist on homeschooling appreciation days or parades. They simply wish to be left alone to raise their own children. The Second Amendment community, again, 18 million Americans with a concealed carry permit, maybe 20 million hunters, the people who, the half of the country that owns a gun, that simply wants to be left alone to defend themselves and protect their families and have their Second Amendment rights respected, okay? Taxpayers don't raise my taxes. Businessmen and women do not regulate or tax my business, my profession, out of existence. I want the opportunities that previous generations had for myself and for my family. Just leave me alone. They're not asking for subsidies. They're not asking to have the government kneecap their competitors. They simply wish to be left alone. All the communities of faith, where people wish to be left alone to practice their faith and transmit it to their children. They're not asking for Baptist stamps. They simply wish to be left alone. And that means religious liberty for everybody, even if the guy over there completely misunderstands Scripture and is going to Hades rapidly. We all have to have religious liberty so that we can defend it and protect. And around our table, this is why our team can work well together as opposed to the other guys. Because around our table, nobody wants anything at the expense of anyone else. The person who wants to make money all day can look across the table at the guy who wants to go to church all day and say, it's not how I spend my time. And they both look over at the guy who wants to fondle his guns all day and say, maybe that's not how we spend our time. It's not important how we spend our liberty. It's important that we agree to vote for candidates that will leave each of us alone. We're the Leave Us Alone coalition. They're the Takings coalition. They view the proper role of taking things from one person, giving it to someone else. Oddly enough, that's usually money, and it's usually them that get the money. The labor union bosses, the big city political machines, the government worker unions, the two wings of the dependency movement, people who are locked into welfare dependency and the people who make $100,000 managing the dependency of other people, making sure none of them get jobs and become Republicans. Their team can get along as long as we are foolish enough to raise taxes and throw money in the center of their table. Because then they can look at each other the way they do in the movies after the bank robbery. One for you, everybody's cheerful, everybody gets an Obama phone, some cash, they're happy. That's why what I do at Americans for Tax Reform is I ask all the candidates to make a commitment to the American people in writing, not that we don't trust you, but two witnesses and dated, that you will oppose and vote against any tax increase, period. About 90% of Republicans take that pledge and have kept it. To give you some idea of how powerful branding the modern Republican Party as the party that will not raise your taxes has been, in the 60 years before the pledge, the Republicans had the House and Senate for 4 of 60 years. Since the pledge clicked in and all the Republicans took it, we've had it for 2/3 of both houses, for 2/3 of the 24 years since. It pays to be the party that will not raise taxes and therefore will focus on governing so that it costs less and we can reduce spending by reforming government. But until you take taxes off the table, there's never any discussion about reforming government at all. If we do our job properly and say no new taxes and mean it and hold to it, then the pile of cash in the center of the Takings Coalition Democrat precinct worker table begins to dwindle. And they begin to look at each other like the Kennedy kids with only like one six-pack in the middle of the table. If there's not enough cash there, instead of being cheerful, boom, 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 they begin to look at each other like the second to the last scene in those lifeboat movies. Now we're wondering who we're going to eat or throw overboard. Our job is to stop all tax increases, so as that pile goes down, the other team begins to nibble on the legs of the people next to them. When we meet them in the next election, there are fewer of them, they're shorter. The modern Democratic Party is not made up of friends and allies, as the conservative, free market, leave us alone, Reagan Republican Party is. The left takings coalition, the Democratic coalition, is a collection of competing parasites. And they will turn, if we don't let them eat taxpayers, they'll turn on each other. We're holding on taxes. I think you're going to have a cheerful news in the next few months with the elimination of the taxation of inflation inside capital gains. By executive order, this administration, I believe, will soon say that when you sell a house or land or a stock that you've owned for 50 years, you don't pay taxes on the difference. You take the inflation out of that and you pay it only on the real gain. That, I think, will be the final nail in the coffin of the left, which is building their own political coffin by going as crazy to the left as they are. We've delivered prosperity, we've delivered income increases and more jobs. The judges were nice too. The deregulation was pretty cool. And we need 4 more years to keep this project going. Thank you very much for having me here. Good to see you.